In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history began. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. Their objective was simple yet monumental: to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe and begin the liberation of the continent. Success would open a Western front, relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, and hasten the end of World War II. But what if the invasion had failed? What if the Allies had been driven back into the sea? What if D-Day had become not the beginning of liberation, but a catastrophic defeat that changed the outcome of the war? To imagine this alternate history, one must first understand how close D-Day came to failure in reality. The invasion was a massive gamble. It relied on a narrow window of favorable weather, on precise coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, and on the element of surprise. A single major disruption, a storm, a miscommunication, or a faster German reaction could have turned success into disaster. The entire operation depended on deception. Under Operation Fortitude, the Allies created a phantom army led by General George Patton, supposedly preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and double agents convinced the Germans that Normandy was a diversion. This deception worked. When the landings began, Hitler and his commanders hesitated, believing the real invasion was yet to come. For nearly 24 hours, crucial panzer divisions were held back. That hesitation gave the Allies the time they needed to establish a beachhead. But suppose it had gone differently. Suppose the German High Command, perhaps warned by a shift in radio intercepts or a sharp-eyed reconnaissance pilot, had realized the truth. Imagine if Rommel, instead of being away for his wife's birthday, had been present to direct the defenses. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzerlehr could have moved toward the beaches within hours, not days. Their armored counterattack might have struck before the Allies could unload sufficient armor and artillery. The beachheads would have been thin, disorganized, and highly vulnerable. On Omaha Beach, where American troops already suffered appalling casualties, a reinforced German defense could have annihilated the landing forces entirely. The Americans had nearly been pushed back even as it was. Their first waves were decimated, their engineers killed before clearing obstacles, and their communications in chaos. A determined counterattack by German armor could have sealed their fate. The sea would have run red, and the survivors would have had no choice but to retreat to their landing craft, if any remained. Elsewhere, British and Canadian forces faced their own difficulties. At Juno, Gold, and Sword Beaches, progress was slower than planned. A concentrated German counterattack along the Ken sector could have isolated them from one another. If the beaches were cut off, evacuation would have been impossible. The result? Tens of thousands of Allied troops trapped, killed, or captured in a single day. The psychological shock of such a defeat would have been immense. For months, the Allies had promised the liberation of Western Europe. Every resource, every factory, shipyard, and airfield had been focused on making Operation Overlord succeed. A failure would not just be a military disaster, it would be a political earthquake. The British public, weary after years of bombing and rationing, might have questioned whether the war could ever be won. Churchill's government, though resilient, would have faced immense pressure. In the United States, President Roosevelt would have confronted furious criticism from Congress and the public. The midterm elections of 1944 could have turned against him. The perception of Allied invincibility would have been shattered. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin would have erupted in rage. For years, he had demanded that the Western Allies open a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on the Red Army. With the failure of D-Day, Stalin would have accused his allies of incompetence or even betrayal. The already fragile alliance between East and West could have splintered. Trust, never abundant, might have evaporated completely. The Red Army, left to fight alone, would have continued its brutal advance toward Germany. But without a Western front, the Soviet offensive would have taken longer and cost even more lives.
Stalin, convinced that the Western powers were deliberately stalling, might have pursued more aggressive post-war ambitions, perhaps aiming to occupy all of Central Europe, not just Eastern Europe. On the German side, the propaganda victory would have been colossal. Goebbels would have proclaimed the failed invasion as proof of divine favor and the superiority of German arms. Hitler, whose popularity had declined since Stalingrad, would have regained prestige. The morale of the Wehrmacht would have surged. German soldiers who had begun to doubt victory might have found renewed faith in their Führer. Strategically, a failed D-Day would have freed Germany to shift more divisions eastward. In reality, after June 1944, Hitler was forced to divide his forces between two major fronts. Without an Allied foothold in France, the Western Front would have remained quiet, allowing Germany to send reinforcements to the Eastern Front and to Italy. In Italy, the Allied advance northward had already bogged down against the Gothic Line. A D-Day failure would have left the Italian campaign as the only front in Western Europe. Churchill had long favored a Mediterranean strategy, pushing through the Balkans, but the logistics were daunting. The terrain favored the defenders, and progress was slow. With Normandy lost, the Allies might have poured reinforcements into Italy, but that would not have led to a quick route into Germany. Instead, the war might have reverted to an air and naval campaign. The Allies could have continued the strategic bombing of German cities, hoping to cripple industry and morale. Yet by mid-1944, Germany's air defenses remained formidable. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, would have been reinforced by the saved panzer and infantry divisions no longer needed in France. Bombing alone could not win the war. The question then becomes, would the Allies have tried again? Could they have mounted a second invasion in 1945? The answer depends on resources, politics, and timing.
Rebuilding the invasion force would have taken months. Thousands of landing craft would have been lost or damaged. Ammunition, vehicles, and fuel stocks would need to be replenished. And the political will might not have survived. The British economy was exhausted. American industry could sustain production, but public patience for another massive invasion after a humiliating defeat would have been limited. It is possible that the Allies would have shifted their focus to southern France or even Scandinavia, seeking a new entry point into Europe. But these alternatives offered little strategic advantage compared to Normandy. The English Channel remained the most direct route and also the most heavily defended. Meanwhile, Hitler would have strengthened the Atlantic Wall. The beaches of France would have become fortresses. Every failed landing would have reinforced the German belief that the West could not invade successfully. German engineers would have mined every likely approach, reinforced every gun position, and stationed panzer divisions closer to the coast. The next invasion would have faced nearly impossible odds. In the East, the consequences would have been even more dramatic. The Soviet Union was already driving westward with massive offensives in Belarus and Ukraine. Without the distraction of a Western front, the Germans could have concentrated their best units, the panzer divisions of Army Groups Center and South, against the Red Army. The result might not have stopped the Soviets entirely, but it could have slowed their advance. Cities like Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna might have fallen months later, perhaps even in 1946. A prolonged war would have reshaped the balance of power. Stalin's armies, bearing the brunt of the fighting, would have emerged even stronger politically. The Soviet Union would have occupied more territory by the time Germany finally collapsed. In this alternate timeline, the Iron Curtain might have stretched to the Rhine. For Germany, survival in 1944 would not have guaranteed ultimate victory, but it would have extended the war and perhaps altered its ending. The production of V-weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, would have continued without interruption. With months or even a year more to develop them, Germany might have launched a more devastating campaign against London and Antwerp. Jet fighters such as the Me-262 would have been produced in greater numbers.
These weapons could not have reversed the overall imbalance of power, but they might have inflicted severe damage and delayed Allied progress. The human cost of a failed D-Day would have been immense. The thousands who died on the beaches in our reality would have been joined by tens of thousands more in a failed evacuation. Entire divisions could have been wiped out. The war in Europe, which ended in May 1945 in our timeline, might have continued into late 1946 or even 1947. Millions more civilians would have died in the bombings, battles, and reprisals that followed. And across the Atlantic, a different storm would have been brewing, the atomic one. The Manhattan Project was nearing completion by mid-1945. If the war in Europe had still been raging, the first atomic bombs might not have been dropped on Japan, but on Germany itself.
The moral and geopolitical consequences of such an event would have been staggering. In this alternate timeline, the summer of 1944 ends in chaos. The Allied invasion of Normandy has failed. Tens of thousands of soldiers are missing, killed, or captured. The beaches are littered with burning vehicles and wreckage. Across Britain, hospitals are overflowing with the wounded. The once celebrated phrase, "the tide has turned," has been replaced by grim silence. Within days, Hitler orders massive parades in Paris and Berlin. German newsreels show captured Allied tanks and prisoners marching through the streets. The propaganda machine roars to life. Goebbels declares that Germany has achieved the greatest victory since Dunkirk. The Atlantic Wall, he boasts, has proven impregnable. Across occupied Europe, collaborators breathe easier, believing that Nazi rule may yet endure. But beneath the triumphalism, the German High Command faces a difficult truth. The Reich has survived the invasion, but the war is far from over. The Allies still control the skies. Their bombers strike at night and by day, hammering Germany's industrial heartlands. Yet the morale boost from repelling D-Day buys Hitler time. Time to reorganize, to reinforce the Eastern Front, and to imagine new superweapons that could change the course of the war. In Washington and London, shock gives way to anger and recrimination. Roosevelt calls an emergency meeting with Churchill and Eisenhower. The room is filled with silence. For the first time, the unthinkable has happened. An Allied defeat of catastrophic proportions. Eisenhower, once confident, offers his resignation. Churchill refuses to accept it but cannot hide his despair. Britain, he knows, cannot afford another such failure. American newspapers run headlines of disbelief. Invasion repulsed, Allies driven back. The public demands answers. Congressional hearings begin. Some call for the focus to shift entirely to the Pacific, where the United States is still advancing against Japan. Others insist that Europe must remain the priority. Roosevelt faces a political crisis on the eve of the 1944 election. His opponents seize the moment, arguing that the administration's obsession with an early invasion has cost thousands of lives for nothing. Across the Atlantic, Stalin watches with fury. He summons the Western ambassadors to the Kremlin and delivers a scathing speech. The Red Army, he reminds them, is carrying the full weight of the war. The promised Second Front has collapsed. Soviet intelligence reports that Germany is already transferring divisions from France to Poland. Stalin demands immediate compensation, more supplies, more aircraft, more tanks, and he hints darkly that if the West cannot deliver, Moscow will pursue its own separate peace. This is not an idle threat. In 1944, Stalin still remembers how Lenin had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk a generation earlier. If the Red Army bleeds alone while the West falters, Stalin might consider a temporary truce with Germany to rebuild his strength. Even if such a peace were short-lived, its impact would be seismic. Germany would be able to consolidate its forces while the Western Allies would lose their greatest partner. In this world, Allied intelligence scrambles to prevent collapse. Operation Bodyguard, the deception campaign, is expanded to new extremes. The Allies leak false plans of a coming invasion through Norway, hoping to confuse German defenses. But few believe them now. The illusion of Allied infallibility has been shattered. The Germans expect another attempt, and this time they are ready. By the end of 1944, the war in Europe enters a frozen stalemate. The Western Allies continue to bomb German cities. Massive air raids on Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin cause devastation. But German resolve remains unbroken. The Luftwaffe, reinforced by new jet squadrons, strikes back effectively. The cost in Allied air crews rises sharply. The British Bomber Command begins to run short of experienced pilots. Meanwhile, the Red Army continues its brutal advance, but slower than before. German reinforcements redirected from France stiffen the Eastern Front. The battles of the Vistula and the Carpathians become drawn-out slaughters. Soviet casualties mount into the millions. For every kilometer gained, thousands die. By spring 1945, the front line has moved little. Stalin blames the West and promises revenge. In London, Churchill proposes a new strategy: to strike through the Balkans and link up with Soviet forces in southeastern Europe. The plan is ambitious but logistically nightmarish. American generals oppose it, arguing that it would divert resources from a potential second invasion of France. But the British press the point: anything to open a front on the continent and relieve Soviet pressure. By mid-1945, the Allies begin preparations for Operation Overlord II, a second invasion of northern France. The beaches chosen this time are in Brittany, farther west, where German defenses are somewhat weaker. Yet every Allied planner knows the risks. The element of surprise no longer exists. Hitler's armies have dug in, transforming coastal France into a fortress. As preparations continue, another weapon enters the picture, one that did not exist in 1944. In the deserts of New Mexico, the first atomic device is tested. The United States now possesses the power to annihilate entire cities in a single strike. Originally developed to force Japan's surrender, the atomic bomb now offers Roosevelt an alternative path in Europe. Could this be the ultimate weapon to break Germany without another Normandy? The debate divides the Allied command. Churchill is horrified but pragmatic. He argues that if the weapon can end the war, it must be used. Eisenhower hesitates, aware that history will never forget such an act. Roosevelt, weakened by illness, weighs the political and moral costs. In this alternate world, the decision comes not in July, but in late 1945. The first atomic bomb is dropped, not on Hiroshima, but on Hamburg. The results are apocalyptic. In a single flash, one of Germany's largest cities disappears. 100,000 civilians die instantly. The world sees a new form of warfare unleashed. Hitler vows revenge, declaring that Germany will develop its own atomic weapon. In truth, the Reich is nowhere near that capability, but propaganda claims otherwise. The German people, shocked but defiant, rally behind their leader once more.
Internationally, the use of the atomic bomb on Europe divides the Allies. Stalin is both terrified and enraged. He realizes that the West now possesses a weapon that could destroy any army or city within hours. His trust in Roosevelt, already strained, collapses entirely. Even as the Red Army fights toward Berlin, Stalin orders his scientists to accelerate the Soviet atomic program. The seeds of the Cold War are planted not in 1947, but in 1945, amid the smoking ruins of Hamburg. The second Allied invasion follows in early 1946. Operation Overlord II begins with atomic bombardments along the French coast to clear fortifications. The beaches are transformed into wastelands of glass and ash. Allied troops land under eerie silence, advancing through radioactive haze. This time, they succeed. German resistance collapses in the West, but at a terrible cost. France is devastated, its towns obliterated by the same bombs meant to liberate it. By mid-1946, Allied and Soviet forces meet along the Elbe, just as they did in real history, but under far darker circumstances. The two armies eye each other with suspicion. Europe lies in ruins, divided not by ideology alone, but by mutual fear of annihilation. Millions more are dead. The United States and Britain possess atomic dominance. The Soviet Union commands vast armies occupying half the continent. The war has been won, but peace is already lost. In this timeline, the post-war world is unrecognizable. Germany is no longer a defeated democracy to be, but a radioactive wasteland, partitioned into military zones. Western Europe, scorched and depopulated, struggles to recover. The Marshall Plan, if it comes at all, must now rebuild cities that have ceased to exist. The United Nations forms under the shadow of nuclear terror, its first act being to regulate atomic weapons that have already been used twice on European soil. Japan, seeing Germany's destruction, surrenders without a single bomb dropped on its cities. Yet Asia does not find peace either. With the Soviet Union emboldened and distrustful, Stalin expands influence across Manchuria and Korea. The Cold War begins years earlier, colder and more dangerous than ever. Back in Britain, Churchill delivers a grim speech. "This is not victory," he declares, "but survival bought at the price of our civilization." The British Empire, exhausted, collapses faster than in our reality. The United States emerges as the undisputed superpower, but haunted by the memory of the atomic flame that ended the war. In Germany, survivors of Hamburg speak of shadows burned into the walls, of cities erased in seconds. Humanity has entered the nuclear age not through Japan, but through Europe itself. For historians in this alternate world, the failure of D-Day becomes the pivot on which everything turned. One missed invasion, one disastrous day, reshaped the century. The war still ended, but with the cost multiplied tenfold, with the map of Europe drawn in ash instead of ink. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. History is not inevitable. Victory and defeat often hang on the narrowest margins. A misread order, a delayed tank, a storm on the morning of June 6th. The success of D-Day in our reality was not guaranteed.
It was fragile, perilous, and nearly undone by chance. Had it failed, the modern world would have been built not on liberation, but on radioactive ruin and mistrust. In the end, imagining a failed D-Day is not merely an exercise in speculation. It is a reminder of how much depended on a few thousand men crossing a few miles of sea, and how easily history could have turned toward darkness. The courage of those who fought on the beaches of Normandy prevented not only military defeat, but the collapse of Western civilization itself. Their success ensured that Europe would be rebuilt, not annihilated, that peace, however uneasy, would replace endless war. The real D-Day succeeded, barely, but decisively. And because it did, the world that followed, though imperfect, was spared the nightmare of atomic Europe. Yet it is worth remembering how close it came to the other path, the one where D-Day failed and the world paid a far greater price for victory.